Or, God forbid, Red Allen in Frank Wakefield. Oh, God, that was a zoo.
Well, how was that a zoo? Tell me
No, Red Allen, somehow or another, he wound up using our phone and making all these long-distance calls. And then he changed to say that we were learning and flying by the seat of our pants was putting it mildly. So there was no contract, and he basically said, no, you said you were paying me this amount of money, which was more than what he was getting paid. So it was like all of this tension, and oh God, he was just.
And you put him on at the university in a room or a recital
at
hall
Willard Strait Hall at one of the, well, it was really the best acoustics on campus, and I forget what the hall was, but I mean what the name of the particular room was.
What did the room hold in terms of people?
No, probably like 600-800 people.
How many people would come to well, you never got to see how many people would come to a George Pegram show.
Right.
How many people would come to a Red Allen show?
We could sometimes get that many people.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. How many shows do you
Partly
think?
because there was the radio station, and we would, Ken was doing a bluegrass show at the station irregularly, but enough that we could do it in advance of when we were putting on a concert. And frankly, it was a much simpler time in terms of how much was going on campus. So a lot of people would simply go to it because it was a folk show on campus. And with them trying to promote it as much as we could through Bound for Glory, which was Phil Shapiro's folk show on WBBR, and doing the bluegrass show on Sunday morning on BBR, we could get enough people that we could hopefully break even.
So here both in Boston with the Boston Friends, was there a consensus that this was also a political as well as a musical project?
Yeah. Because we always looked at anything that is counter to mainstream culture, and that helps to keep alive a tradition that's other than mainstream middle class, mass consumer society culture alive is politically significant and radical.
Did you think about how you might jibe that with the sense that some of the people you were presenting might have been conservative, mainstream?
Yes, we did think about that, and frankly, I would say it was not a source of disillusionment, because don't ask me how we were sophisticated enough at that point to realize it, but we did realize that very few people necessarily are all that cognizant of their place in culture or their place in the society. And actually, I mean, in Bill's and my case, we did read enough of political theory that there's no question that, I mean, the oppressed, of course, absorb ideas from the oppressive culture about themselves, so they don't. And so they don't necessarily think of themselves as, oh my God, I'm oppressed. They often will absorb some of the most rigidly conservative and racist and sexist and so on values of the society that they live in, because these are people who don't have a lot of wherewithal in many cases to think for themselves.
Did you ever try and talk politics with your artists? I don't see that. I guess I could go up to today, although I don't see it so much as an issue today as it might have been back when you were.
Yeah. Yes, we did. It was more in the South, actually. And it was more in the sense of just sort of trying to have a meeting of the minds. And we were, in fact, more often than not, surprised at how much, in terms of just cultural values, we might have in common with many of those people. In other words, once you get beyond the stock things that would divide people, whether it was the Vietnam War or whatever, we found that it was absolutely amazing at how much people had in common.
I would think you would have had a lot in common coming from the Baptist church in a relatively rural community.
Yes.
A lot in common.
Yeah, I did understand their language, but even aside from that, Ken and Bill too. I mean, it's sort of like if you appreciate their culture in a way, it was such a it was such a reaching out and crossing a bridge that in fact they would then in fact try to be as respectful and understanding of your culture as you wanted to talk about it. And that it is simply being there and sitting down with someone face to face was, in a certain sense, I suppose you could say, a revolutionary act. It's like saying, we may not agree about every single thing in terms of strict, narrow politics, but when we sit down and we're talking about values about life and music and so on, it was amazing how many things we found that we had in common with the people who were, in some cases, generations, of course, older than we were.
Well, it's actually very much the SDS model from SDS earliest days, participatory community work, before SDS went nuts.
Yeah, and a belief Bill and I, as I say, we're very self-consciously anarchists too. And if you believe in participatory democracy and you believe in decentralized models of government, then decentralization is, that's really what it's all about. If you go to those people, to their culture, somehow or another you break down all of those artificial layers that have been placed on top of power and money and status and so on. And it was amazing, just, on a sheer human level.
You need to
I need to run now. I need the roots of the whole tradition. So it was a very it was a really exciting place to be doing work and to be discovering a lot of artists who had been overlooked for a really long time.
Now, just a little timing. You had said long hair at the Folklife Festival was in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
Probably was a little later. You hadn't put out an album in the summer of 1970 yet, so it might have been
71.
71. Okay, you had just gotten going.
I'm not actually sure. It's possible that it was even the summer before we put out our first records.
To the Folklife Festival a little earlier?
Yes.
Okay.
Because in fact we were selling records like Folkways and County and whatever other ones we could get, and taking them down to festivals in the South very, very early, either before we put out our first records or right about the same time that we put out the first two. What year did we hear Professor Longhair on the Mall in Washington? You don't remember? It was either 70 or 71. My recollection was that 70 was the year, just because it was much, much later, that there were tapes that had been done on that same first trip that Bearsville owned that we were able to license and put out. And I wonder if I can get, let's see. How can we get that turned off, Bill? Is there any way? The intercom. I guess. Okay. We'll see.
Now, even before that, you had done some of the country Louisiana material. I don't know how involved you were. You put out the Rinsler tapes. You put out where you'd licensed about the Brothers.
And Ken made his first Cajun trip in, I think it was 74, on his own.
Okay.
And my recollection was that it was 74, and that was around the time of at least initially making contact with D.L. Menard toward the end of making a recording. Toward the goal of making a recording anyway.
Right.
And that was on one of Ken's initial trips down there. And yeah, it's true, from the around the same time that we were, as I was mentioning, selling records at the festival on the Mall, one of our earliest contacts was with Ralph Rinsler, because in fact he loaned us a Nagra from the Smithsonian Division of Performing Arts to use for recording spoken word interviews and so on, and anything else we could use it for on the trips down south. So yeah, and that was how we talked with him about getting the rights to put out some of his tapes, and that was around the same time we first heard Professor Longhair.
Now, what was your first actual musical excursion, professional, so to speak? Well, I guess I don't mean professional, but your first foray into live Louisiana, New Orleans music? Or the personalities surrounding it? Did you first go down and start meeting?
Well, I was, Ken and Bill were much more experienced in terms of the actual recordings than I was, and at being 4 years older, they'd been 4 years longer in the Boston area and going to folk and blues clubs and so on, and than I had been. So I kind of had I guess you could say an immediate immersion. I was sort of thrown into the middle of it the first time I went with Ken and Bill to a fiddlers convention, which was while I was still in college, and this was, I guess, in 69. I think it was in 69 that I first went with them to the Union Grove Old Time Fiddlers Convention and to Galax for the first time, which they had done before. And I think my first live music contact with Louisiana music was hearing Professor Longhair that summer.
Okay.
Then in terms of going to New Orleans, it wasn't until quite a bit later, after, as I mentioned, Scott had come back and told us about how many great performers there were at the Jazz and Heritage Festival. The Jazz and Heritage Festival, interestingly enough, kind of grew up at the same time that we did, something that we weren't terribly aware of, but the two people who started the Jazz and Heritage Festival were in fact the two people who first managed Professor Longhair at the time of his quote-unquote rediscovery, and that literally was within the same several-month period we became aware of only much later that we started Rounder.
Who were they?
The late Allison Caslow, whose last name was, let's see, I guess her name at that time was Allison Miner, M-I-N-E-R, and Quint Davis, who still is the producer along with George Wein of the Jazz and Heritage Festival. But they were sort of, two hippies, basically, college dropout hippie types who started putting on concerts in clubs locally and were involved in starting Tipitina's, which had been a kind of legendary New Orleans club, and also starting the Jazz and Heritage Festival literally on a shoestring budget, just doing it on the streets of New Orleans. And that was at the same time, as I say, within a few-month period of the time that we started Rounder. And now, over the years, in addition to Scott going down to the Jazz and Heritage Festival and our becoming aware of other people like Toots Washington through Jeff Honish, then eventually we also, through becoming more aware of the music there from going to it, and I think I went probably, a couple of years after Scott first started going and making the recordings was when I first went back down there, and listening to the music that Scott had been telling us about and going around to clubs with Jeff and with Scott and some other people whose records we started nationally distributing shortly after that. It was kind of, and as I said, it's not the term I want isn't trial by fire, but it was just like an incredibly deep immersion boom like that, as particularly I think could happen to people during that time period, perhaps more than now, because the Jazz and Heritage Festival was just on the verge of becoming the kind of huge in terms of numbers and commerciality, although I think musically it's very true to what it was back then. It's just so daunting now, at least I find, just in terms of the numbers of people who were there. But it was the best way to hear New Orleans music and then to go back and hear Mardi Gras Indians at Mardi Gras time and so on, instead of just hearing them on some of the records that had been out of print for a long time, and where we then went and made records with Mardi Gras Indians and with some of the Dirty Dozen Brass Band, who Scott wound up producing remixing and producing some tapes that had been made in Montreux. And this was when the Dirty Dozen Brass Band was basically the only brass band that was doing any touring outside of New Orleans, had sort of been a big hit at the Jazz and Heritage Festival, and had ever, at that point, toured outside the United States. This is before the Rebirth Brass Band, who ultimately, I think, had more sort of street success in New Orleans than the Dozen did. But the Dozen, in a way, was more interesting in terms of just having representing a broader range of New Orleans music, from not just the brass band tradition, but also some really incredibly good jazz players, and were really very, very exciting to us. And so through the folks at the Jazz and Heritage Festival, the people I mentioned who had initially managed Professor Longhair, we wound up getting in touch with the Montreux Festival and being allowed to use those tapes, and that became our first Dirty Dozen record, which was in the Modern New Orleans Master Series. So we did the Dirty Dozen and the first Indians records that had been done in, I would say, a decade or two, and the only music by them that was in print at that point. So it was it was yet another cycle in all of that, but there was so much incredible music, such a depth and of music that just people would come and say, wow, this is overwhelming. But on the other hand, for all sorts of reasons, I don't think it, at least at that point, there was not very much potential for it becoming mainstream music.
Sure.
So people would go, they'd get excited about it. There might be a brief fad where one producer or another would come and put out some records by these people, but then they'd be out of print like that because it wasn't enough to satisfy the companies in terms of sales to keep it around. So we not only built up a whole series, but we kept them in print. And I think it's definitely safe to say that no major label would have been satisfied with the kinds of numbers that we got. But on the other hand, as long as we could keep doing it and keep breaking even and then have an occasional record that would do better than break even, it was sufficient reason to keep that series going. In addition to just how great the music was. And then, of course, at the same time, Scott, since we're talking about Louisiana generally, started following some of the Zydeco acts, and then going back to, of course, as we talked about earlier, the early 70s, Ken had become involved with the major Cajun artists who were still left, which at that time included, of course, the Balfour brothers, who are no longer with us, but now, of course, we work with Christine Balfour, the daughter of one of the Balfour brothers. So I think it's interesting to see how the tradition has continued, and that's how we want it to be.
What?
Am I talking loud enough?
I hope so.
Good.
Everything worked out.
I'll try.
Time, except for you and I had breakfast together, and then we continued taping in the car, and I so far have lost everything that was on the highway.
Oh darn.
Well, I will get it back. I have somebody at my wife's place, office, they have the whole sound studio there, and they're going to be able to. The voices are clear, but
there's just a lot of
they're
road noise.
Present. They're not decipherable. They're clearly there underneath this. And then when we got onto the surface streets, we could hear each other again on the tape. We were still in the car.
Yeah.
So that was just
mysterious tape sounds. Not that I remember what we were talking about, but it's just that riding in the car is often a really good, I find, a way to just sort of be able to kind of free associate.
Where were the performances in those early years of the Jazz Fest? I've been there, but it was only a few years ago, and it's, as you said, it's overwhelming.
Yes.
People, it's a deal.
In the early years, which were before we were going to it, any of us, including Scott, they literally were just at clubs around town and on the streets. It seems to me that I can't remember whether Congo Square, which is what is now Louis Armstrong Park, or whether it was someplace closer to the actual downtown, like closer to Canal Street in what is now sort of a business district. It seems to me that there were some outdoor venues that they used there. But from the time that I was going, it was always at the racetrack. It's just that the numbers were so much less daunting. I mean, there were always a lot of people there, and that was a part of the excitement, and the fact that there were always multi-stages, so you constantly having to choose between which stage you wanted to be at, and if you were there with a couple of other people, then send them over to listen here, and you'd go there. And I remember Ken and Scott and I in particular doing that 1 or 2 years because there was so much music to hear. But yeah, that's where it was by that time. But then, of course, it was over 2 weekends, and then you could pick out the people you liked hearing best at the racetrack, and then go and hear them at the clubs during the week, which was then even more fun because you got to see them in a smaller setting.
Yeah, you must have met some of the artists early on as someone who was going to be putting out their records. Did that come about at some point?
Yeah, yes. I mean, and actually, none of us were all that shy about going up and just talking to people. I actually remember being literally in touching distance of Professor Longhair that year in Washington, D.C. And I don't remember if we actually had a chance to talk with him because really there was such a crush of people, both people from from D.C., like from the Smithsonian. I can't remember if Bruce Iglauer from Alligator was there or not, and Bruce, of course, did Professor Longhair's last recordings right before he died in the, I can't even be sure of my dates here, whether it was the late 70s. I think it was the late 70s. But anyhow, there were just tons and tons of us, but just being that close and seeing him and maybe at least having a chance to shake hands. But the Balfour Brothers, we saw a lot at folk festivals during that time. So from the Cajun tradition, D.L. Menard is someone also that we all met very early on and who was really inspirational to us, both as a chair maker as well as a musician. Well, he was just such an incredible, down-to-earth guy who, to me, I guess, given my values and priorities also, was just a wonderful guy because he was just so personable. It was not that he was a musician first and foremost, it's that the music was a part of his life and a part of his family life, a part of his social life, and that he did talk about chair making almost as much as he talked about music. And so, yes, it was aesthetically incredible that he was the Cajun Hank Williams and knew all of these Cajun musicians, many of whom were either recently deceased or even had been dead for a long time, but whose names we had read, in liner notes and so on. But to me, it was also just the force of who he was as a person, and I mean a very loving person, a very giving person, and someone who was a real character and right out there in terms of just the sheer emotionality. And some people, I suppose, might call it charisma, but to me it was more just like who he was as a person. And that was the thing that I also felt about Professor Longhair, who I learned many years later was definitely a major pothead, which was not the case with many of the white Cajun musicians. But on the other hand, I don't know whether that contributed anything to what a just incredibly funky, just a guy with a great smile as wide as all outdoors.
Well, we contribute to that.
And who was definitely in no hurry, didn't seem to be in any hurry to do anything or get anywhere. And it's something that in terms of a lot of the kind of the contacts we had with whatever folk cultures were still as close to being a folk culture as you can find in the late 20th century, was really that was, as I say, to me, inspirational almost as much as the music. Was that whole side of things.
And did you get to know Professor Longhair at all?
I did not, although I sort of felt like I did from all of the reading of interviews and things like that with him, and from having seen him live that time, and then listening to a lot of the old tapes, the Bearsville tapes, even with Scott when we first went into the studio with those. That was I'm not one of the studio people here. Ken has always been that, and Scott has always been that, as much as he's been our salesperson, our advertising director, our graphic designer, and so on. But in that case, with both the Dirty Dozen tapes and with the old Professor Longhair tapes, that was like history in the making, and we did those at a studio near here out at Blue Jay.
You say history in the making. Why? Because of the first.
Because
after such a long gap.
yes, exactly. And so some of it is re-recording songs, because he didn't have a huge repertoire. But on the other hand, he was such just a funky performer that everything is like pretty, well, just definitely very funky and slightly different. And in fact, I think he became more improvisational and definitely funkier the older he got, to the point that it did require, some of it was actually too funky for release. But I mean, you know, in the earlier years when he was doing the Mercury records and stuff, everything was much more like you go into the studio, you do this in the one take or two takes, and you do it, you fit it in a very short period of time, because that's the way they made records back then, in terms of the singles or 45s that he would have been recording, and it would have been for a commercial market, whereas after his quote-unquote rediscovery, it was really much more part of the folk boom. And as a result, I think there was a lot more room for him to just sort of stretch out and be a character, because frankly, he was as much a character in my estimation as he was a musician. And it's kind of silly to think that a lot of the people who were such characters who are still around and performing, including, for example, Bouzou Chavis, today, he's not what you would call a great musician. Professor Longhair was a great musician in the sense that he was a seminal piano player, for sure, and that in terms of the rhythm of his playing, he's influenced hundreds of musicians since then, if not thousands of musicians since the time that he was first recording and rediscovered. So it's kind of fun.
Now explain Too Funky for Release.
Well, if something was just so far out of tune and just rhythmically so off, it just wouldn't do any credit to his legacy. So there had to be some sort of cleaning up of things in the studio, which Scott was really good about doing and can tell you more about it than I could from a technical standpoint, because I'm happy to say that I'm not a musician any more than Ken or Bill are musicians.
Who did you end up getting to know? Like, well, let me backtrack a little bit. You put out what was the first one you said was issued as ultimately as modern New Orleans masters?
The very first one, I can't remember if it was Toots Washington. We can check in the catalog and I can tell you that. But Toots was definitely one of the first ones, and I think I did meet Toots once. Although some of this, it's hard for me to actually remember. I do feel that some of this is almost like a dream, which is, I realize that already at the relatively young age of 51 is how I relate to a lot of my earlier life, meaning going back to even when I was in college and even high school, I guess, and even the early years of Rounder. I feel that way. I think I met Toots Washington. Toots Washington played at the World's Fair in New Orleans, which was held in 1984. And in fact, bizarrely enough, he died on stage playing piano, I believe, at the World's Fair. Jeff Honish and Scott could both confirm that or not for you. But he was very old at that point. He was well into his 80s, I believe. And again, just a totally inspiring character with like stories and stories and stories. And you know, a lot of this, I don't know how you're going to be relating to it in the writing that you're doing, but a lot of this has to do with, you know, the function of memory. Because a lot of the people that I found myself most inspired by or overwhelmed by are people who have a very loose connection to memory in the literal sense. And I guess that's true for a lot of my favorite writers. I mean, it's sort of like, what is apocryphal? Is it as real as literal memory? I think it probably is. And I have a feeling that half the stories, the people I liked most, whether it was D.L. Menard or Professor Longhair, from what I've read about him and from knowing Allison, we did come to know both Allison and Quint quite well. Scott knows Quint and Allison quite well also. And from all of their stories about Professor Longhair, it's definitely true that when you have someone who probably was smoking pot pretty much every day from the time he was probably a teenager, I dare say that a lot of his memories were pretty apocryphal as opposed to literal. On the other hand, there may be a lot more truth in that story than stories that are factually much more accurate, perhaps. And so I feel that way about. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of what is true and what is false anyway, in terms of your true story may be a story that is false in a lot of respects. I mean, your true story in terms of who you are and where you've come from and what has made you the person or the performer or the musician that you are today. And I can see that even in my own life, and let alone in the lives of people who have lived, who did ultimately live almost twice as long as I've lived now.
Did Scott bring you ultimately end up bringing you most of your New Orleans musicians? Is that how they came to most of them?
In various ways. Scott mostly, for sure, because Scott was out there doing the actual A&R in terms of going to clubs and being very, well, you know him, and his style is very methodical. So he's the one who definitely was doing a lot of the methodical legwork of the whole process. And then, as I say, through Jeff Honish and through, well, Quint, the Dirty Dozen and the Professor Longhair, which definitely were the most acclaimed in terms of the Longhair one of the two blues Grammys that we won. The other one was for Scott's Gatemouth Brown record. That was earlier than the Professor Longhair tapes that we put out, even though, of course, it was recorded afterwards because the Longhair tapes have been around at Bearsville for such a long time. But, through Scott, and then as the series got going, we, of course, had a lot more people who would be coming to us. And during the time that Ron, my still husband, and I were together, both he and Scott were in New Orleans a lot of the time. Ron partly because he was working with Blacktop, which we nationally distributed at that time, and because he was playing on a lot of other people's records, and therefore got a lot of tapes from other musicians as well. So during a certain period of time, I would say it was probably close to 5 or 6 years, we also got a lot of tapes through Ron as well as through Scott, and then between the two of them, they produced almost all of the records that we did there, unless there were occasional things that were more self-produced.
Right. The series itself simply became when you think of series, you think of some sort of coordinated effort, like the Lomax series. Was the Modern New Orleans Masters?
But you know, I think I think a lot of, well, it was a term that Scott actually came up with because he felt that it would help us to market all of these. Although I'm not sure that it was that, for example, if you look at Lomax's various series, unless it was something that he was doing that had a finite number of records in it for a record company or something, I'm not sure that it's not perhaps hindsight that makes those things look like they had more of a series developed and fleshed out thing before he started to do them. I think, in fact, that it was probably very much a similar process, in fact, which is you do one thing, you do that one or two things, you realize there are 3 or 4 other things that are also interesting that you discover in the process of doing these. And that's very much how the Modern New Orleans Masters series developed, and at the same time, because of course nothing is really separated from everything else, a lot of the Cajun and Zydeco artists were playing at clubs in New Orleans where Scott would have first heard of them, and then started going out more to South Louisiana, to Cajun country, as Ken had done in the first half of the 70s, after we'd first made contact with the Balfa family and with D.L. Menard and so on. So I think, in fact, it was not that we had an overall series in mind with X number of releases
Sure.
that were to represent thus and so. It was more that it was an ongoing project.
Right.
So that was the type of series that it was, and in that sense, I think a lot of the parts of our catalog and the numerical series, for that matter, are like that. We never envisioned a particular beginning, and I mean, obviously the beginning is the first one you put out. Although in many cases we had, in fact, made a commitment or knew that we wanted to do certain records that didn't necessarily come out numerically first, because it was whatever came together first for release. So in fact we might have released, say, 4003 before we did 4001 or whatever. So it was very much that way with the Modern New Orleans Master Series. There might be gaps of several records that we knew we were in the process of working on, and that came out after some other things that were numerically later. Yeah, it did actually. I mean, it was part of the what we originally envisioned as a blues series, which was yes, exactly. But
it doesn't have a grouping within that.
It doesn't have a grouping within that, although there were various times that almost everything in that series was coming out from New Orleans. So
Starting in 2000. Okay.
yeah. And then, of course, after we started Bullseye, we started putting almost all of the blues as well as New Orleans rhythm and blues on Bullseye. So, in fact, that's the way things are working now.
What kind of a feedback did you get from the first New Orleans records and later ones? Can you drum up any sense of what the reaction was?
I think it's safe to say that there was a lot of critical acceptance from, I mean, unquestionably, there was a lot of critical acceptance from the very beginning. And Scott's idea of having a quote-unquote Modern New Orleans Master Series with its own logo and so on helped us several years running in conjunction with the Jazz and Heritage Festival to get some major press, because of the fact that we did envision it and market it and promote it as a series. And what we would try and do is aim to have several important releases come out before Jazz Fest each year, so that in fact we could get like that. There were several years that USA Today, for example, would do a whole thing of this is what you need to listen to before you go to Jazz Fest kind of thing, and where we would have the bulk of, or embarrassingly enough or wonderfully enough, almost every single record that was there, except maybe, say, Alligators, Professor Longhairs or something. And it would also be a good way of getting, after Tower opened up, and even before then, when Metronome Records still existed, to get a whole section of artists who are going to be at Jazz Fest this year, and get them a prominent display place. Back in the days when there weren't quite as many records coming out, frankly.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get to know any of the Zydeco artists that came a little later on?
I never, yeah, well, I think we all probably had a chance to meet them, and because we all went to hear them when they would play in town. Beaujacques, I don't know if I met Little Brian, actually. Scott, of course, was responsible for most of the A&R contact with them, because he was producing the records with them. And Ken continued to be the person who was most in contact with the Cajun artists. I had more contact with the New Orleans artists up until the time that AJ started school, and now I haven't been to New Orleans for the last couple of years anyhow. But for a while, including after the time that AJ was first born, I was in New Orleans a lot and had a lot of, in fact, I remember when my son was 3 months, not even 3 months, no, he was only a few weeks old, sitting around the kitchen table at the apartment where Scott still stays when he's doing work for us in New Orleans, and sitting there with the Rebirth Brass Band, real sort of just up front, all talking at the same all talking at the same time, young guys in their, I guess they were at that point still in their teens, some of them, and them all sitting around the kitchen table, and AJ sitting in his little stroller at the kitchen table and taking a nap, while Ron and I were having a discussion with them about the contract before going into the studio. So there were a lot of those, and in fact during those years, Marcia Ball and her entire band stayed in one room at the apartment, and then after she had played her gigs, it was a year that they hadn't booked hotel rooms enough in advance, so she stayed there with the band. And then after she'd done her gigs, we went out on the day of the Zulu parade, which is the day that the Mardi Gras Indians head down to the parades, and going over to that part of New Orleans and being there when they all gathered in their costumes to parade and play music over to downtown. So there were a lot of times like that with, and then Irma Thomas, and going to hear her in her club and stuff, and spending a lot of time at Tipitina's hearing people. So that was where I had my most contact with the music, except for hearing them initially at festivals and so on. And that was, which in fact is the music that even now still interests me and excites me most, I would say.
Really?
Yep.
Now, who are some of the blues artists that you got to know? You did once or twice.
Johnny Adams.
Did you know Johnny Adams?
Yes, because in fact at the time that Scott had made his first couple of records, Johnny was at that point still living in New Orleans, and Walter Washington, who we still record now on Bullseye, was Johnny's band leader. And there was a certain period of time, actually even before I knew Ron, or before AJ was born, of course, that I would go down and listen to Johnny and Walter at Dorothy's Medallion Lounge and places like that, to me, and it was kind of the ending of that period in the New Orleans club scene, for that matter.
What was
that
Dorothy's
was
Lounge like?
Oh, they actually, Scott can tell you all about it because he went there before I did. I was certainly following in his footsteps, but they actually had go-go dancers on stage, and they literally didn't, this is not that there were yuppies in the audience, because there really weren't, but they just didn't start playing until sometimes 11 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the morning, or quote-unquote whenever the musician showed up. And then Johnny and Walter, if they were fighting, I remember once, one year that I was at the festival, I think the week before Scott got there, and I was supposed to give something to Johnny, and I can't remember whether it was a check that he was waiting for, or a tape that he was waiting for, or whatever, but going over there, turned out that Johnny and Walter were having a fight, so Walter and the band played, but yet I felt duty bound to sit there, and there was this one other woman from New York who was a publicist working for us at the time, who was there with me, and she's like, when can we go? And her head is on her table and she's falling asleep. Well, finally Johnny showed up at I think something like 5 o'clock in the morning their time, and then I had to wait to talk to him after he just started singing, and it's this place that is just reeking with smoke. And it was the day of the time change, so by the time I actually got to talk to him, it was like 7 o'clock in the morning, and we'd spent the entire night there. Or maybe I should say the entire nightmare there. But times like that, even though it was kind of appalling at the time, it was also just sort of interesting to kind of just sit there and talk to Walter and listen to the band, and it was just an experience that was, as I look back on it, it was well worth having, even though at the time it was pretty awful.
Did you get to know Irma Thomas?
Irma, yes, although she's someone unlike Walter and Johnny, who is always much more conscious of her public image. So, in fact, going to lunch with Irma on several occasions and being invited into her home to have her cook for us, and I think this is before she and Emile, her husband, had the Lion's Den, sort of afforded the kind of, it's interesting, because right now, there are all of these interviews going on with Aretha Franklin. And Irma, as a type, as a personality, is very similar. They both are very private people who are very concerned about the public image that they think they tailor it a lot. So with John, and I'm not sure where all of that comes from. I think obviously in Aretha's case, it's from the church and the fact that her father was such a prominent public figure. But in Irma's case also, there's just, she wants to be regarded as someone who's more of an R&B diva, as opposed to someone who could ever let her hair down and be funky in the way that, say, Johnny just was. He just was himself. He thought he was presenting a certain public image, but he certainly wasn't very good at it if he was. And he was always living close enough to the edge. He didn't have the kind of financial security that Irma did, and therefore you didn't get invited to his home with the swimming pool in the backyard and the 2 Mercedes in the driveway, the way Irma and her husband have been able to present themselves.
How about James Booker?
And James Booker actually, just at the time that that Scott was working on, and it took a lot of work to work on the 2 records, and I'm sure he can tell you in great detail how torturous the process was. But I think I got to hear James Booker only once, and it was not a good night, and there were many of those not good nights. On the other hand, I did become very good friends with a guy from New Orleans who was a bass player with Booker during the very early years when he was really a very bad junkie and was constantly standing up the band, either in terms of running off with the money, and Reggie Scanlon, who's the bass player in the Radiators today, has memories of chasing Booker up the alley to get paid his, pitiful pittance of $20 or $30 for having played in some strip club, while Booker is making eyes at some guy who's hanging out on the piano with him, and then Booker going off to cop some drugs with a little bit of money that that the band, meaning Reggie and a drummer, were supposed to get paid or something, and then not speaking for a few weeks or a few months, and then of course it's such a small, particularly in those days, was such a small world that eventually, well, you'd get back together again because it was a way of gigging and getting some money. So I sort of, again, it's one of those things, as I was telling you before, I personally had virtually no contact with Booker, but not so much through Scott's stories, because Scott was trying to get Booker, of course, to produce, but through other people, like in particular Reggie. I almost sort of feel like, and from having been there, like I could picture those scenes, and that feels more real to me than a lot of people. Okay, thanks, Rocky.
Yeah.
I actually feel like I know him in a way, and also because of Confederacy of Dunces. Oh, you should experience that book. It was a crazy story and a crazy novel. Well, it's the character who's in it, the protagonist, is a very Booker-esque kind of character, also very larger than life, and just living in a world of his own devising. That's a very large world that encompasses practically all of the streets of New Orleans. And the guy who wrote that book, who committed suicide in his, I don't know, early 30s or something like that. It's just a real slice of New Orleans street life that I think it's true for Scott. I know it's true for me. And Scott, in fact, was reading that book when he first started going down to New Orleans, and then turned me on to it. And it wasn't too many years after it had first been published, but it's a book that, in a way, if I tell you this, you may say, but you digress. And I would say, yes, but it's in ways that are truth-telling in terms of the whole New Orleans experience. Walker Percy, the National Book Award-winning Southern novelist, had, when he was teaching at, I think it was University of New Orleans, or it might have been at Loyola, anyhow, he was teaching in New Orleans, and a woman came to him with a shoebox with a manuscript in it. And that was the Confederacy of Dunces. And he took it to, this was after he'd won the National Book Award for the moviegoer in the early 60s. So this was like the late 60s, early 70s, something like that. And he went to every publisher to try and get them to publish this, and said that he thought it was an incredible, an incredible work, and that it certainly should be published. And so he kind of championed it, and he couldn't get anyone to publish it except for Louisiana State University Press, which is a really, as you probably may already be aware, publishes a lot of really fine fiction and poetry and literary criticism. So LSU Press published it, and then eventually it was published. It did wind up being published by a major trade paperback publisher. But it really is, to me, a book that captures that whole time, and that it's very Booker-esque. I mean, it's a picaresque novel, one of the best American picaresque novels ever, in my opinion, even though it's such a large novel and so unedited in some ways that you may say it's a seriously flawed novel. Maybe that's true, but it's certainly no more flawed than, say, You Can't Go Home Again, or or some of Thomas Wolfe's novels that wouldn't have been as good as they were without the kind of editing that they got. But that is New Orleans, and it's New Orleans music, and it's the New Orleans streets. And the truth of that novel is like the truth that's in New Orleans music, and that's in the lives of the larger-than-life figures of, whether it's Mardi Gras Indians, or the leaders of the brass bands, or whether it's Louis Armstrong, or whether it's not so much Johnny or Irma, because R&B is so much more, at its least polished, it's still so much more polished than Professor Longhair or all of those guys. But to me, that to me was like the kind of bluegrass that moved me most, and like the kind of blues that moved me most.
The attitude of guys like the Mardi Gras Indians toward recording, how did they approach that process? Or maybe you're the wrong person to ask.
No, because I was there for when we did like Bo Dallas and the Wild Magnolias.
Yeah, it's a tough thing.
Ron was in the studio producing them, and he was in fact a very good person to do it, because he was, in fact, he would engage in that kind of back and forth sort of bullying and game playing and mind game playing that they all would. I mean, partly it was frankly just a way to make money, and they definitely were still fairly unspoiled in the sense of they knew what they were doing was good music, but they didn't really care how good the music was. They wanted to get paid for it whenever they could get paid for it, because of course there's not a lot of pay for that kind of music. But it was also, it would be a mistake to say that they had some sense that they were creating great art.
Okay.
And in fact, that's one of the things I liked about it.
Oh,
it was just very spontaneous, and it was very like, I'm here, you want to make a record? Fine, get a record out of me, and I'll do the best no, it wasn't even that I'll do the best I can. If I can have a good time doing it, I'll do the best I can to make a record for you.
Did they have some other sense that we're not creating great art? Did they have some sense they were tapping into some type of street tradition or local tradition? Did they
And they were very proud of that. Definitely very proud of that, because the Mardi Gras Indian tradition, in fact, in some ways, it has been kind of corrupted by people from outside telling them how great the tradition is, too. There's no question about that. But at the same time, hey, if that's all you got, well, go for it. I mean, and it is true that most of them were, even at the time that we did our records with them, very poor and living basically fairly hand-to-mouth existences, not making music. Monk Boudreaux, who was, again, another one of those very just incredibly sweet guys, was making his living as a house painter, and was a very sweet guy with a very sweet soul and a very good heart. And then there was Bo Dallas, who was is a remarkable chief, and who has a very bad drinking problem. And you can't deal with them without dealing with those realities of the ghetto life from which they come. And I'm not even talking the projects. The projects in some of these cases would be a step up from where they live. But there aren't many middle-class Mardi Gras Indians, for example. And I don't mean middle class in the sense of bourgeois and that's a put-down. I mean even in terms of, yeah, right. Their sense of middle class would be, judged in the way the rest of the nation would look at things as definitely lower middle class at best.
Was there a sense that they wanted it to sound like a Mardi Gras Indian record? Did they talk about doing it right or doing it wrong?
Yeah, definitely, yeah. And sometimes they could be very opinionated about that. And it's also true that it still is a rigorous enough tradition that there was a sense that if somebody could teach them something in the studio to help it sound better in the sense of the way it should from where they're coming from, traditionally speaking, that they would be accepting of that too.
Who would that come from? Would that come from Ron?
Yes, actually, because Ron, back from the years that he was on the road with B.B. King, spent a lot of time in New Orleans. In fact, he slept on Allison and Quint's floor when B.B. would go to New Orleans and be playing, several nights running there, or be there on vacation for that matter, because B.B.'s life was the road, and Ron was with him for about 7 years. And there were some very good New Orleans horn players who were in B.B.'s horn section at the time that Ron was there, so he would often go and hang out with the Turbenton brothers, who recorded some of those crazy R&B things, and Earl Turbenton, saxophone player, who's also a very, very sweet guy, but with lots of psychological problems. He's manic depressive, and he would be on and off medication, and depending on what else he might be doing, he could be better or worse, but he was known as the Coltrane of New Orleans, and deservedly so, in terms of just being a really fine, underrated sax player.
I'm worried I'm losing you. Bill is almost louder than
Do you think we should go into the conference room?
Maybe. Let me see what's coming through here. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine.
Talk about Bo Dallas, I think.
Oh, yes. And all of it's interesting. I mean, as we're talking about it now, a lot is coming back to me in terms of the people that sort of stick out in your mind, and unless you're specifically thinking about it. But yes, Bo was a great voice, and just one of those. He was a real leader in his community, but he was also, in my opinion, I mean, the way I saw him, really a sort of sad person.
How a leader?
And not just because of his drinking.
How a leader in his community?
The Mardi Gras Indians are leaders in their community, and they're just in the sense that, if nothing more than the neighborhood bar.
Okay.
But the neighborhood bar is a community gathering place in their communities, and the people, I mean, there are sort of showdowns or shout-outs or whatever you might, shootouts. Actually, there was one record we did call a shootout, I think, that was between Bo Dallas and Monk. And Bo was definitely one of those real extroverted characters, although at the same time I felt that there was a real sort of a sad part to him, and I think his drinking was indicative of that. But Monk, on the other hand, was much quieter, more introverted, a quiet sort of leader who led more by example, and who definitely spent a lot of time by himself, whereas I can't imagine Bo Dallas very much outside of always having to be in company. But the personality, as you can tell from what I'm saying, to me personality has a great deal to do with not just music, but I suppose with everything. And I mean personality not in the sense of superficially, but personality in terms of the story of your life.
Did they have a realistic sense of what the recording was going to do for them?
And some did and some didn't. I mean, I think that it's probably, to a person, true that anyone who makes a record, hopes that it's going to communicate to the largest number of people possible, and some people aren't very realistic about that. Some people may be more realistic, but it doesn't mean that deep down they can hope for more. And of course that is sad, although I will say that I think that's true in almost any medium you can think of, whether it's poetry or literature or music.
What did those Indians and the Rebirth Brass Band, and probably might be different,
Mm-hmm.
but not to date so much, but in their first couple of years, what's the order of magnitude of sales and something like that?
If you're lucky, a few thousand.
2,000 or 3,000
Mm-hmm.
is a
Yeah.
good.
In the case of the Mardi Gras Indians, I would say at the height, because there was sort of a kind of cresting during the late 80s, early 90s, when the Jazz and Heritage Festival was really taking off, that it was a little bit easier, both because there were more opportunities media-wise in terms of press, and there was, I think there was less competition on the press front and a little less competition in certain types of radio, like NPR and so on. So it was possible for us to get enough attention that some of them may have sold initially somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 even. And it seems to me that it's that Bo's biggest selling record, that the Wild Magnolias record that has a great headshot of him on it, may have sold like 10 or 11,000. But you can check that, of course, in the by the actual figures. But that would have been at the height of it, and that was way more than the old Mardi Gras Indians records had sold when they were first done by whatever his name was, Billy Brow, for.
Okay.
So